I knew my father had chosen my sister long before he stood up at Thanksgiving dinner and announced it in front of everyone. What surprised me was that, after making his choice so publicly, he still expected me to help him. For most of my life, I had been the practical child in our family. My sister, Claire, was the one everyone celebrated. I was the one they called when something broke. When Dad needed help understanding a tax form, he called me. When Mom needed someone to drive her to an appointment, she called me. When the basement flooded during a storm, I was the one who showed up with a wet-dry vacuum and stayed until midnight. Claire lived 3 states away and usually appeared for the big moments. Birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, family photos. She had a way of walking into a room and making everyone feel like something important had just happened. My parents loved that. I never resented her for it. At least, I tried not to. Claire wasn't a bad person. She was just used to being the center of things, and my parents had spent 37 years teaching her that she deserved to be. I was 34 at the time, married, working in operations for a manufacturing company, and living about 40 minutes from my parents. Claire was 32 and had recently left a marketing job to join her husband's real estate business. Dad admired that. He liked telling people his daughter was building something. When I mentioned my promotion that summer, he nodded and said, "That's good. Steady work is important." When Claire bought a new SUV, he spent 20 minutes asking about the engine. That was our family dynamic. I had stability. Claire had excitement. And somehow, excitement always mattered more. The Thanksgiving incident started a few weeks before the holiday. Dad called me on a Tuesday evening. "Can you come by Saturday?" he asked. "Sure. What's going on?" "I want to go over some paperwork." I assumed it was something involving the house. My parents had owned the same brick ranch outside Columbus, Ohio, since I was a kid. It wasn't huge, but it was paid off, and Dad had always talked about keeping everything simple. When I arrived Saturday morning, he had 3 folders spread across the kitchen table. Mom was sitting nearby with coffee. Claire wasn't there. Dad tapped one of the folders. "Your mother and I have been thinking about the future." That sentence immediately made me uncomfortable. What kind of future? He looked at Mom, then back at me. "We've decided we're going to make some changes." I waited. Mom said quietly, "Your father wants Claire to have the house someday." I honestly thought I had misunderstood her. "The house." Dad nodded. "Claire needs it more than you do." I looked down at the folder. "Why?" Dad seemed almost offended by the question. "You already have your own home. So does Claire." Not the same situation. I knew what that meant. Claire had debt. Claire's business was inconsistent. Claire had recently complained that her husband was putting too much money into renovations. I said, "Okay." Dad leaned back. "You don't sound surprised." "I am surprised." "Then why aren't you upset?" I looked at him. Because that was the problem. I had spent so many years being the reasonable one that everyone assumed I couldn't be hurt. I said, "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "Nothing." Mom interrupted. "We just wanted you to know before Thanksgiving." I nodded. "All right." Dad frowned. "That's it. What else should I say?" He didn't answer. I left 20 minutes later. I drove home angry, but not because Claire was getting the house. It was because Dad had somehow turned my reaction into another test. If I was upset, I was selfish. If I wasn't upset, it meant the decision didn't matter. There was no answer they would accept from me. Thanksgiving arrived 2 weeks later. Mom hosted. The dining room looked exactly like it had every year. The good plates, the silver serving spoons, candles nobody was allowed to touch, and Dad's old wooden table with an extra leaf added in the middle. Claire arrived late, wearing a cream sweater and carrying an expensive bottle of wine. Dad practically stood up to greet her. "There she is." Claire laughed. "Sorry. Traffic." Dad hugged her. "Don't worry about it." I was already seated. My wife, Megan, was beside me. She squeezed my hand under the table. She knew. Dinner was mostly normal. Dad talked about the Browns. Mom complained about grocery prices. Claire told us about a property she and her husband were considering buying. Everyone asked questions. Then, after dessert, Dad cleared his throat. I knew immediately. He picked up his glass and said, "Before everyone leaves, there's something your mother and I want to announce." Claire looked curious. Mom looked nervous. Dad smiled. We've decided that Claire will take ownership of the house when we're gone. The room went quiet. Claire's eyes widened. Seriously? Dad nodded. Seriously. She looked at Mom. Are you okay with that? Mom smiled. Of course. Claire hugged them both. I sat there with my hands folded. Dad looked directly at me. You understand, right? Every eye turned toward me. I could have said a dozen things. I could have reminded him that I'd spent years helping maintain the property. I could have asked why my parents hadn't even discussed it with me. Instead, I said, yeah, I understand. Claire smiled. Thank you. I wasn't sure why she thanked me. Maybe she thought I had somehow approved. Dad continued. We just think it's fair. I nodded. Okay. Then Claire said something that changed the entire tone of the evening. I always knew Dad would do the right thing. Megan's expression tightened. I looked at Claire. She didn't seem to realize how that sounded. Dad laughed. Well, you are my daughter. Claire smiled. So is he. Dad looked at me. You know what I mean. I did. And for the first time, I stopped trying to pretend it didn't hurt. I stood up. Thanks for dinner. Dad frowned. You're leaving already? Yeah. Don't be dramatic. I'm not. I put on my coat. Mom followed me into the hallway. I'm sorry, she whispered. I looked at her. Are you? She didn't answer. That was enough. I went home. For the next several weeks, I stopped being available for family errands. Not as punishment. I simply realized that I had built my life around being useful to people who rarely asked what I wanted. Then, in January, Dad called. His voice sounded different. Can you come over? Why? I need to talk to you. I almost said no. Instead, I went. When I arrived, Dad was sitting at the kitchen table with the same 3 folders. Only this time, there was a 4th one. He looked tired. Claire changed her mind, he said. About the house? No. I waited. She wants to sell it. I wasn't surprised. Dad looked embarrassed. She says she needs the money for the business. Okay. Your mother and I don't want her to sell it. I leaned back. Then don't give her the house. Dad stared at me. It's not that simple. It sounds pretty simple. He rubbed his forehead. We've already signed documents. I looked at the 4th folder. What documents? He pushed it toward me. I opened it. It wasn't a deed. It was a copy of an estate planning agreement. I read the first page. Then the second. Then I stopped. Where did you get this? Dad looked confused. What? This isn't the new agreement. He stared at me. What do you mean? I turned the document around. This is an older trust document. Dad's face changed. I recognized the name of the attorney at the bottom. It belonged to my grandfather's estate lawyer. My grandfather had died 6 years earlier. Dad had always told us there was nothing complicated about his estate. He had left his house to Dad, some personal belongings, and a small amount of money to charity. At least, that's what I thought. I turned another page. There was a clause I had never seen. My grandfather had created a family investment trust. Dad was the trustee, and according to the document, the trust contained shares in a small regional equipment company. I recognized the company's name. It was the same company my grandfather had worked with for decades. I looked at Dad. Why didn't you ever tell us about this? He didn't answer. How much is in it? That's not important. It is if you're giving Claire the house because you think she needs financial help. Dad stood up. You don't understand. Then explain it. He sat back down. Finally, he said, your grandfather wanted you to have something. I felt my stomach tighten. What? Dad's eyes became wet. He told me before he died that you were the only one who reminded him of himself. I didn't know what to say. Dad opened another folder. Inside was a handwritten letter. My grandfather's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Dad slid it across the table. I read it twice. Grandpa had written that he trusted my judgment more than anyone else's in the family. He specifically instructed Dad to keep the trust separate from the family estate until I was financially mature enough to manage it. There was also a condition. I wasn't supposed to receive the trust simply because I was his grandson. I had to demonstrate that I could manage it responsibly. Dad had been required to oversee the trust until I turned 35. My 35th birthday was 6 months away. I looked at him. So the trust still exists? Dad nodded. Yes. How much? He hesitated. About $800,000. I sat completely still. $800,000. My grandfather had left me a future, not a lottery ticket. And my father had never told me. I asked why. Dad looked down. Because Claire was struggling. I laughed once, but there wasn't anything funny about it. So you hid my grandfather's trust because Claire was struggling? She needed help. I needed honesty. He looked at me. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. You're right. That was the first time in my entire life my father had said those words to me. He continued. I thought if I gave Claire the house, she'd finally be secure. And what did you think would happen to me? I thought you'd be fine. There it was. The sentence that explained my entire childhood. You'd be fine. I was always fine. Because I didn't make scenes. Because I paid my bills. Because I worked. Because I handled things. My father had mistaken independence for invulnerability. He pulled another paper from the folder. There's one more thing. It was a letter from my grandfather addressed to both of us. Dad had never opened it. He had been keeping it with the trust documents. I read it silently. Grandpa wrote that money should never be used to reward whoever demanded it most loudly. He said he had watched his children for years and noticed something important. Dad gave the most to the person who complained the most. He hoped Dad would eventually understand the difference between helping someone and enabling them. At the bottom, there was a sentence addressed to me. He wrote, "If you're reading this, don't let this money convince you that you finally earned your family's approval. You never needed it." I had to put the letter down. Dad wiped his eyes. Your grandfather knew me better than I wanted him to. I looked at him. What do you want from me? He took a breath. One last favor. I almost smiled. Of course. Even now. What favor? I want you to help me fix this. He explained that Claire had already been told she would inherit the house. She had started making plans. She had even talked to a realtor. If Dad suddenly reversed everything, the family would explode. He wanted me to sit down with everyone and explain the trust. I said no. Dad looked stunned. I thought you'd help. I will help you do the right thing. Isn't that what I just asked? No. You asked me to clean up the consequences of a decision you made without me. He was silent. I continued. You need to tell Claire yourself. He nodded slowly. Will you be there? Yes. A week later, we all met at my parents' house. Claire arrived expecting an argument about the property. She had no idea about the trust. Dad told her everything. At first, she laughed. Then she stopped. Wait, you're saying Grandpa left him $800,000? Dad nodded. Claire looked at me. And you knew? No. She stared at Dad. You knew for 6 years? He nodded. Her face changed. You gave me the house because you thought I needed it. Yes. And you didn't tell him about the money? Dad looked down. Claire stood up. So you were deciding who deserved what based on information you kept secret? Nobody spoke. She walked to the window. For once, she didn't have a clever answer. Then she turned toward me. Did you know Grandpa wanted you to have it? Not until recently. She nodded. I feel stupid. I said, you didn't know either. She sat back down. I thought you were angry at me. I was hurt. What's the difference? I didn't want you punished. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I think I got used to being chosen. That was probably the most honest thing she'd ever said to me. Dad cleared his throat. The house stays with us. Claire nodded. Okay. There was no screaming. No dramatic confrontation. Just a family finally forced to look at something we'd all known for years, but never said aloud. Dad asked if I wanted the trust transferred immediately. I said no. I wanted an independent attorney to review everything. I wanted the investments evaluated. I wanted the trust handled exactly according to Grandpa's instructions. Dad agreed. 6 months later, on my 35th birthday, the trust officially became mine. I didn't buy a sports car. I didn't quit my job. I didn't tell everyone how much money I had. I kept working. I paid down our mortgage. I set aside money for retirement. And I donated a portion to the local food bank my grandfather had supported. Claire eventually sold the business she'd been struggling with and took a job she actually enjoyed. She and I started talking more. Not every day, not like best friends. But honestly, Dad also changed, although slowly. He started asking my opinion before making family decisions. Sometimes he still slipped into old habits. Once, when Claire mentioned wanting help with a business idea, Dad immediately offered to co-sign something. I interrupted. Don't do that unless you're comfortable losing the money. Dad looked at me. Then he laughed. You're right. This time, I laughed too. The strange thing is, getting the trust didn't feel like winning. The real victory happened earlier, when I stopped waiting for my father to choose me. For years, I thought being overlooked meant I wasn't valuable. My grandfather understood something I didn't. Being the dependable person in the room can feel like being invisible when you're young. But eventually, you realize people who constantly need to be chosen aren't necessarily the strongest people in the family. Sometimes strength is simply building a life that doesn't depend on being chosen at all. My father chose my sister at Thanksgiving. Then, months later, he asked me for one last favor. I helped him, not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted the house, and not because I needed to prove I was better than my sister. I helped because my grandfather had taught me something worth more than the money he left behind. You can't control who recognizes your worth. You can only decide what kind of person you'll be while you're waiting. And once I stopped waiting for my family's approval, I realized I had already become the person I had spent my whole life hoping they would finally see.